The world's eyes are on The Hague this afternoon. In about 20 minutes' time, the International Court of Justice will deliver an interim ruling in South Africa's genocide case against Israel. The court is not dealing with the merits of the broader allegation of genocide at this stage and will only rule on South Africa's request for emergency measures to protect Palestinians from potential breaches of the Convention on Genocide. For more, I'm joined in studio by SABC International News Editor Sophie Mokoena and SABC News UN correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who joins us from the UN headquarters. Good afternoon. Sophie, let's start off with you. I mean, minutes before that important ruling, the big question is, what impact will the judgment have, whichever way it goes?
Well, it will have a huge impact, as you heard earlier on the package yesterday where Sherwin was unpacking the story. The reality is, whichever way it goes, it will have a huge impact, particularly for people in Palestine, because at least now the world is focusing its attention on Palestine, and people are weighing in relation to what's happening in Gaza. And I think the other issue, the minister earlier on, Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor, saying that this is exactly what they wanted, using the available means within the multilateral institutions to ensure that you are able to address the challenges facing the world. If South Africa doesn't get all it wanted or all the number of issues that they have raised, I think for them it will still be an important milestone, in a sense that they will not have that guilt that they didn't do anything when people were dying in Palestine. From Israel's side, if they lose it, it's going to have a huge impact, because even though the Prime Minister of Israel has said that he's not going to listen to The Hague, the member countries of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, and particularly those who are supporting Israel, they will think twice. You know that the European Union has already made a statement that they will respect and abide by the ruling of the World Court.
Sherwin, let me come to you here. I mean, clearly this is the UN court and the world body has been monitoring this case. After the ruling, what will the responsibility of the Security Council be?
Well, the Security Council, Nastasia, will come into play if the parties to this matter do not implement the judgment of this tribunal, right? All member states of the United Nations, by virtue of them being members of the United Nations and the UN Charter, is therefore subject to the statute that created the judicial organ of the United Nations, known as the International Court of Justice. So there's a responsibility on states to adhere to the rulings of the court on paper. But in practice, often these rulings, binding judgments, binding resolutions from the UN Security Council are often not implemented. So it then falls to the membership of that UN Security Council to impose measures to enforce a judgment that sometimes doesn't happen. Why? Because countries have national and bilateral interests that sometimes circumvent the multilateral consensus that we tend to seek at these United Nations. So Israel's Prime Minister, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu, has said no one will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anyone else. So giving a clear indication that no matter how this order from the ICJ falls, Israel might not comply, even though the UN Charter, the statute of the International Court of Justice is very clear that member states must comply with their binding rulings. And what Israel has done so far is to show up, right? Israel sent a legal team to defend itself in terms of the accusation that South Africa was making in terms of the Convention on Genocide of 1948. They showed up, they recognized the court's jurisdiction. So what are we going to see play out in a few hours? The court is going to come in and it's going to do one of two things. It's either going to say there is no case for Israel to answer here and dismiss the case outright, which seems unlikely, or it will say there is a prima facie a case to be made here. Prima facie, of course, means it's true, valid, or sufficient at the first impression. So they're not going to make a judgment on whether there's genocide or not, but they're going to say there's some prima facie issues here that will lead us, therefore, to impose some provisional measures that could speak to some humanitarian relief. Remember, the big ask from the United Nations, from South Africa, has been for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, because the aid that is getting into Gaza is not getting in at the scale that is required on the ground. It is not commensurate to the need in Gaza. And so the big ask here is for some humanitarian relief, for more medical supplies to get in, for issues like water and food. You know, the UN is pointing to catastrophic levels of food insecurity in Gaza, some 500 million people, essentially a quarter of the population in the enclave, at risk of famine. So these are some of the things, the nuances that the court will seek to strike. And it might seek to balance Israel's right to self-defense, which has been the big argument against South Africa by the Israelis, their right to self-defense with the rights of the Palestinians that need to live, essentially. And so that balance is something that we're going to certainly be watching very closely, Nastasia.
Right. Sophie, let's come to you here. There are statements from the SA Jewish Board of Deputies regarding that cancellation of flights by El Al airline. Is this linked to the ICJ case?
Well, when you look at the statement, partially so, they are saying that since this hostile relationship with South Africa, number of people traveling to Israel or Tel Aviv and also to OR Tambo or perhaps Cape Town from Israel has gone down, because you know that South Africa took a decision to suspend and to stop operations at the mission in Tel Aviv, and therefore it is very difficult for people to process documents, to process traveling documents and all of that. And clearly that decision by South Africa to recall its officials and junior officials, because you'd recall that the ambassador was recalled 2 years ago. Now the junior officials, not so junior in terms of the performance of their duties, but in terms of not having an ambassador there, they had to come back, and since then they haven't gone back to Israel or Tel Aviv. We know yesterday the Independent Electoral Commission touched on that in relation to South Africans who are abroad, who want to cast ballot, particularly during the coming elections. In relation to the voter registration abroad, it has started today, and you have those technical challenges for IEC. It's not only the IEC, but business as well is affected. That is why when the Parliament approved that motion to completely cut ties with Israel, government is still grappling with this issue, because it will have serious implications in relation to business as well.
Sherwin, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken spoke to Minister Naledi Pandor on the Gaza matter. Is America taking a soft stance now? How do we interpret that?
Good relations between friends that sometimes disagree, Nastasia, is how we should read that. I mean, they're not saying anything different. They're affirming what the United States has done in terms of seeking to walk this very fine line in terms of defending their closest ally in the Middle East and commiserating with an ally that was attacked on October 7th. Civilians were targeted. Atrocities were committed against the Israelis. And the United States believes that that needs to be the focus moving forward here. But they're seeking to balance that position with what we are seeing play itself out in the Gaza enclave, the atrocities that we have seen on our television screens, babies being carried into emergency rooms at hospitals that are not capacitated to deal with the trauma that is being inflicted on people's bodies in the enclave. And so the greater the civilian casualty toll has risen over the last number of months, the United States has needed to recalibrate its position in terms of asking Israel to observe its responsibilities under international human rights and international humanitarian law, given the extent to which we have seen women and children being affected by Israel's targeted bombardments in the Gaza Strip. So they have sought to walk this very fine line, and so you see that emblematic in the statement, in the readout between Dr. Naledi Pandor and Anthony Blinken, who happens to be on the continent at this time, where they are seeking to affirm their support for Israel's right to defend itself, with a recognition that greater care needs to be taken by the IDF in its military offensive in Gaza in terms of the atrocities we are seeing and the great impact we are seeing on civilians, particularly women and children in the Gaza Strip. So nothing new there. The United States has been very clear that this is a case without merit. It is counterproductive. They have been backed by their European allies, many including the United Kingdom, Canada, Austria in Europe. So you're seeing a very divided European Union in that support. But here's the bottom line. No matter what they feel politically about this case, whether they're supporting it overtly or not, the point is that member states of the United Nations are, by de facto, members of the United Nations. They are members of and subject to the rulings of the International Criminal Court of Justice. So if this ruling comes down, these are countries that are going to be looked at to respect and implement this judgment. And so no matter what your political persuasion is in this conversation, these court rulings are binding, and it's going to be up to member states to implement it.
I want to come to you, Sophie. 13 minutes to go. We've just shown the viewers the visuals inside the International Court of Justice in The Hague. What are you anticipating here? I mean, we're seeing the legal team from the Israeli side. The SA delegation may have been spotted, I'm not sure. But your sense of the mood in the room?
Well, clearly you can see it's quite tense because both sides are hoping that they will be able to win this one. And you can see that, as you pointed out, the legal team of South Africa is there. You can see those who delivered that presentation on behalf of South Africa. When you look on the other side, you can see that those who delivered that presentation on behalf of Israel are already there. You'd recall that Israel dismissed allegations that there's genocide intent. They've also dismissed allegations that hospitals were attacked. They've also dismissed allegations that they are disrupting the delivery of aid. But when you look at the visuals coming from Gaza for the past 2 months, we've seen those activities. On the other hand, South Africa is saying there's an intent, because if they are hunting Hamas, for now you're talking about 25,000 people who have been killed, majority being children. And as you can see, Minister Naledi Pandor also arriving, and this morning, earlier on, he made a statement, a recorded statement, talking about the fact that whichever way the ruling will go for South Africa, the intention is to ensure that the issue of the Palestinians is not forgotten. You know that South Africa has been fighting side by side with Palestine before 1994 for freedom of the people of Palestine and people of South Africa. And South Africa is continuing. On the other hand, very soon we will get visuals from Birchwood Hotel, where the ANC is having its National Executive Committee meeting, because they are going to take a break now as soon as the court starts to listen to that ruling. The president will be leading the ANC members of the National Executive Committee in listening to that, and thereafter the president will make a statement, and we expect more people to make statements. As you can see there, the ambassador of South Africa in the Netherlands sitting there, and you'd recall that he did make a presentation, a person with legal expertise, a former DG in the Department of Justice, and therefore I think we are beginning to move towards that all-important moment the world has been waiting for. You can see number of media contingent. It's heavy, because this is a big story, and I think worldwide today the ruling will be carried by all important broadcasters, contrary to the previous one, where the South African presentation was carried by mostly in the south, and then you had the Israel presentation carried by broadcasters in the west and in the south. So today it's a complete different story, and I'm sure, Sherwin, I might predict that the SG might say something after this in a form of a statement or doorstop.
Well, they've certainly indicated, Sophie, that his office, the spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, was asked this very question: can we expect him to come out and say something publicly on the matter? And Stefan, jokingly said that we can confirm that he'll be watching the case, but we'll only know, if he'll come out and speak. One imagines there'll be some sort of statement, whether in person or certainly a text statement from the Secretary General's office, because they are watching this closely, Sophie. They are watching to see if this court is going to say there is a case for Israel to answer in terms of the Genocide Convention, but they are less concerned about that label than they are about getting humanitarian access at scale into Gaza. This is the big push from humanitarians. They've been talking about the fact that not enough trucks are getting into Gaza. There is some relief getting in, but it's not getting in to where it is needed the most. You'll understand that the northern parts of the enclave have been devastated by 3 months of bombardments. It's difficult for trucks to get in across the Rafah border in the south and to travel and to traverse these areas that have been devastated. Infrastructure has been destroyed. Roads have been destroyed. There's a lot of rubble that has not been removed in Gaza. So the ability of humanitarians to get in, to move and create space for aid to travel through the enclave is a big, lamentable issue that the United Nations and humanitarians have been facing now for months. The Secretary General also spoke earlier this week and complained about the fact that not enough humanitarians are being granted visas to enter the occupied territories. And who's responsible for that? The State of Israel is responsible for that. So the UN is very frustrated in that sense. There's a frustration between the interlocutors at the UN and the Israelis. And so they're hoping that the court can provide some direction here, some direction that the UN can hold up, that piece of paper and say, listen, this is what the ICJ has said in terms of humanitarian relief. Let's implement this now. So they'll be watching closely, and we do expect certainly some sort of statement from the UN and others, right? I mean, this is a question that the United States will have to weigh in. European countries that have put their thumb on the scale to say they support or do not support. It's going to be very interesting to see reaction as to what, in terms of what the 17 judges decide in a few moments now.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much there. That is the voice of Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who is the SABC News UN correspondent, and of course, SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena. With just 7 minutes to go, SABC News will bring the ICJ ruling live at 2 p.m. here on the SABC News channel and on the SABC News YouTube channel. As you can see on the screen, and we'll have it on the screen shortly, the Powerball jackpot is estimated at 120 million rand, and you stand a chance to win that tonight. At the top of the hour, the SA Today team will take you live to The Hague and bring you analysis and reaction to that landmark ruling. Stay tuned to SABC News. It's a goodbye from me.